Welcome to Nobilis Erotica, the best science fiction and fantasy erotica anthology podcast in the known universe. This month, gay goblin drama. This is episode 466. I am your host, Nobilis Reed. This episode of Nobilis Erotica is sponsored by the generous patronage of Nobilis Erotica listeners. To help out paying the authors and voices that create these stories, visit patreon.com/Nobilis. The December and January patron-funded story is To Market. Our author, Elizabeth Schechter, has been called one of the top erotica and alternative sexuality writers in the world. Her writing credits include the award-winning steampunk erotic romance House of Sable Locks, the Celtic fantasy Princes of Air, and the 2021 Vivian finalist Written in Water, the first book of the Heir to the Firstborn serial. Elizabeth can be found online at elizabethschechterwrites.com. It's narrated by yours truly. Here we go. To Market by Elizabeth Schechter. Narrated by Nobilis Reed. Chapter 1. The Goblin Market. We must not look at goblin men. We must not buy their fruits. From the poem Goblin Market by Christina Rossetti. My name is Khan, and I am no man's son. My mother claimed to have gotten me from one of the gentry. I don't know the truth of that, if my father was indeed one of the she, or if he was simply a silver-tongued peddler who never thought again of the girl he left behind him in Hunter's Dell. All I know is that for my whole life, it was just my ma and me in our little hut by the edge of the forest. Ma, well, the folks in the village called her Wise Meg, or Uncanny Meg, or Meg the Witch, and they came to her for their charms and simples and all the things that made the parson look down his long nose at us when we came to market. Ma told their fortunes and read their palms, made their love charms and uncrossed their cows, and before she died, she taught me her art. Now the village comes to me. That was how it all began. I had been in my garden that morning trying to convince the small patch of stubborn dirt that I needed radishes more than I needed rocks. When I saw the rider coming up the road, I knew he was coming to see me. I leaned on my hoe and waited, and was surprised to see that it was Patrick Grady who was riding up to my gate. The richest man in the village. Grady looked down at me from atop his tall horse like I was something he'd rather not have found under his boot. Then he swallowed his pride, nodded a curt greeting, and cleared his throat. "I've need of an uncrossing." I nodded. "Is it a cow or a horse you're asking for?" The expression on his face wouldn't have been out of place if he'd swallowed a live toad. "Neither. 'Tis my daughter." I dropped my hoe. "Something's happened to Bess?" He didn't answer. Turned his horse back down the road. "Will you come?" He must have known that I wouldn't have said no, that I would never turn my back on Bess. She was my childhood playmate, a bold, headstrong girl who'd been willing to defy her father because she wanted the village bastard for a friend. She'd wanted to have me as something more, too, the night of her 16th birthday. She'd brought me into the hayloft of her father's barn. Grady and his men found us there, both of us half-dressed. Grady dragged his daughter off to the house, leaving his loyal pack of rowdies with instructions to deal with the bastard. They did, hanging me by my wrists from the hayloft and laying my back open with a horsewhip, then leaving me there until one of the stable boys took pity on me, cut me down, and took me home. A few days later, Grady rode up to our gate, told my mother that if he ever caught me near his girl again, he'd kill me himself. Since that day, I avoided the market. Avoided going back into the village. I couldn't bear the thought of seeing Bess and not being able to go up to her, talk to her, share everything with her the way we had since we were small. But I never stopped thinking of her, dreaming of her, recalling the few precious moments that we'd had in the hayloft before we'd been found. What in heaven's name must have happened to her that could bring Grady to look for my help? Grady's house was the finest in the village, and every time Bess had brought me here, she'd brought me in through the front hall to sit in the drawing room like an honored guest. This time I went to the kitchen door and found a familiar face there. Moira, Bess's old nurse, met me at the door, wringing her hands as she escorted me into the house and up the servants' stairs. "Con, can you help her?" she asked, her voice cracking with fear. "I don't know, Moira. I'll try," I answered, trying to keep my own voice steady. "Where are we going?" "Miss Bess's bedchamber." Moira led me to the second floor and down the hall. Grady himself was waiting outside a door, and as I reached it, he opened the door and gestured me inside. I walked in and stopped, stunned at what I saw. Bess lay in the center of the wide curtained bed, writhing and moaning like a woman possessed. Her fair hair was dirty and matted, her fine gown was filthy, tattered and torn. Worst of all, her arms were spread wide, her wrists lashed to the bedposts. I turned to Grady. "What happened here?" At the sound of my voice, Bess turned. She saw me standing in the doorway, smiled with delight, and called my name. I'd heard her say my name like that once before, and it had made my blood race. Now the heat in her voice and the wildness in her eyes horrified me. I couldn't imagine what could have caused this. Grady gestured for me to join him in the corridor, closing the door firmly behind me. "Tell me what happened," I said, trying to ignore the fact that I could still hear Bess through the door, whimpering and crying, calling my name. Grady shook his head, not meeting my eyes. "We don't know. She went for a walk one evening and didn't come home. The next morning we found her wandering in the sheep pasture on the east side of the village, looking like she'd lost her wits. The doctor's been here and the parson. She attacked the parson, tried to get out of the house. That's why she's bound." Grady stared at the door. "It's been 3 days. She only gets worse." I nodded. He was lying about something, but what I had no idea. "Let me back in," I said. "I need to look at her, see if I can see anything." Grady pushed me none too gently towards Bess's door. "Moira, go with him," he growled. Then he turned and stalked down the hall. Moira held the door open for me, then followed me into the room. Once she had closed the door, I turned to face her. "What is he not telling me?" I demanded. She looked at me and whispered, "He'll have me out on the streets if he finds out I've told you anything." I met her eyes. "Moira, tell me what I need to save her." She looked past me, staring for a moment at the struggling girl on the bed, then nodded. "The master has arranged a marriage for Miss Bess to Lord Faraday." I hissed at the name. Lord Faraday was our liege lord. That didn't mean I had to like the man. He was heavy-handed, I'd heard, and he'd buried 4 wives that I knew about. Moira nodded again. "When he told Miss Bess, she refused. She told him—" She paused and then looked at me. "Con, she told her father that if he forced her, she'd go to the goblins. They didn't find her in the sheep meadow. They found her at Hunter's Oak." I turned and stared at the bed in shock. She had gone to the goblin market? If you were to wander in the gloaming toward the hollow where the tree that the old folks called Hunter's Oak had once stood, you would hear the goblins calling to the unwary. "Who will buy? Come and buy!" No one knew for certain when they had first come to Hunter's Dell. There were some, my mother told me, who were foolish enough to go into the hollow and take what the goblins offered, but when they returned to the hollow, seeking more of the same, they found it empty. The goblins never came twice to someone who had tasted their wares. All of those poor souls had died horribly within a few days, refusing food and drink, pining for whatever they had found in the hollow. Maud told me once that she thought there might have been a way to save them, if there had been someone brave enough to try it. I wasn't brave, but I cared for Bess, and I was bound to try and save her. I crossed to Bess's bedside and sat down next to her. She leaned towards me as much as her bonds would allow, whimpering softly. "Con," she moaned, "touch me, please." Her eyes met mine, and I was stricken to not see the joy that usually shone from behind her own eyes. There was only need there, and want, only what the goblins had thrust upon her. I cupped her cheek and leaned forward to kiss her forehead. "I'll bring you what you need, Bess," I whispered. "I swear it." Then I pulled back, reaching into the satchel I wore over my shoulder, and pulling out a small brown bottle that I handed to Moira. "Give her this. A full dram mixed into some milk. It will make her sleep. I should be back before she wakes, or very shortly after." Moira looked at me in horror. "Con, what are you going to do?" I looked back at Bess, who was crying and calling for me to come back. It near broke my heart to turn away and leave her. "I'm going to the goblins." I took a long breath, gathered my courage, and walked down the hill into the hollow. I could hear the goblins calling from somewhere down near the stream, but until I came up to the remains of the oak, I couldn't see them. And once I did, I had to stop and stare. Ma had never told me that goblins were beautiful. I'd been expecting monsters. Instead, I was facing angels. They were tall and thin, taller than any man, and covered from head to heels in sleek, glistening fur that reminded me of otters that played in the forest pool. They were dressed solely in long, beaded loincloths that swayed in the evening breeze, and they moved with a fluid grace that made them look like they were gliding on air. When one of them turned to look at me, I could see its eyes were golden and slitted like a cat's. It came closer, the setting sun turning its mottled gray and black fur into flame, and when it reached me, it crouched slightly so that it was closer to my height. "Welcome to the Goblin Market, young mortal. Will you come and see our wares?" I nodded, too awestruck to say a word, letting the goblin take me by the hand and lead me into their market. There were carts and baskets full to overflowing with fruit, most of it impossible to find this early in the spring. There were apples piled up next to peaches, full bunches of grapes lying next to cherries and figs, strawberries in baskets with pears and quince. The goblin escorted me from one end of the market to the other, and when we reached the end it waved one arm expansively. "What will you have, young mortal?" I shook off the spell that the goblin's beauty cast over me. I was here for a reason. "There was a girl, a few nights past. What did she choose?" I asked. The goblin laughed. "Ha ha ha! The golden girl. Yes, she came to me, and greatly enjoyed her choice. You wish to have what she had?" I nodded slowly, not sure what I was agreeing to. The goblin took my arm and led me off. I could feel its sharp claws pricking me through my sleeve. It led me away from the market into a copse of young willows that grew along the banks of the stream. In the center of the copse there was a clearing, and it was there that the goblin stopped, turned towards me, and smiled again. "Take off your clothing, pretty mortal," it said, running long fingers through my hair. I whispered Bess's name like a prayer as I unslung my satchel, took off my shirt and breeches. The goblin must have heard me, because it cocked its head to the side and studied me for a long moment. "The golden girl, she is your lover?" The cat eyes narrowed. "No, not a lover, but beloved nonetheless. Why have you come?" "Because I love her," I answered. It laughed, resting one long hand on my back between my shoulders. "Intriguing. Come here, mortal, and see what your golden girl bought at the Goblin Market." The goblin led me to a mossy bank, guided me gently down onto my back, and then stretched out next to me. It said not a word to me, arranging my arms and legs as if I were a doll, until I lay there with my arms flung over my head and my legs slightly apart. It nodded, seemingly satisfied, and then sat up and made a long, low, trilling sound. Immediately I felt something cold curling around my wrists and ankles. I tried to jump up but was held fast to the turf as slender green vines rose from the moss, wrapping around my body and holding me fast. The goblin laughed, moving so that it was again lying next to me, soft fur rubbing against my side as I struggled against the vines. "Pretty mortal," it crooned, and smiled, showing all of its sharp white teeth. Then To my shock, it kissed me. When I was 12, a minor lord who had sought my mother's aid rewarded her with a flagon of fine brandy. Ma had let me taste the wine, and I always remembered the smooth warmth, oak mixed with wood smoke and peat and apples. The goblin's lips tasted like that, like brandy, heat, and desire. I found myself drunk on that taste, forgetting my fear. When the goblin pulled back, I strained up, wanting more, and heard the creature laugh. "Patience, little one, patience." It stood and loosened the belt around its hips, letting the loincloth fall to the ground, revealing to me, finally, that this goblin was male. His cock was erect, long and curved, and thick around as my wrist. He looked down at himself, running one hand down his length. "So, you see now what goblin fruit your little golden girl enjoyed? Would you like a taste?" he asked, and laughed again as he lay back down, running his fingers over my skin in swirling patterns that left fire in their wake. I could feel myself responding to his touch until I ached with desire. He laughed again, sliding down over my body until he lay over my legs, his breath warm on my cock. "You are a virgin?" he asked. "You've never lain with a woman before? Or a man?" Yes. No. I was addled by his breath and his warmth, and wasn't sure what question I was answering. He trilled softly, sliding his hands under my ass. "Untouched fruit is the sweetest. What payment do you offer, young mortal, for your taste of goblin fruit?" Payment? I couldn't clear my head, couldn't think of anything but his kiss and his touch and his breath on my aching, throbbing cock. He ran one finger down my shaft, and I gasped at the sensation. "Barter, perhaps? Will you give me seed for seed?" Without waiting for an answer, he lowered his mouth over my cock, swallowing me whole. It was like nothing I ever felt before, and I howled as he caressed me with his rough tongue and slid one long, slender finger into my ass. I strained against the vines, trying to move, wanting more, even though I had no idea what more would be. I felt him laugh again, and he stopped and raised his head, sliding up to cover my body with his own and kiss me again. "You taste magnificent," he murmured, licking my ear and then nibbling my neck with his sharp teeth. "Shall you have your taste now?" He got to his knees, shifted, turned around until his cock depended over my mouth. I heard him laugh again. "Do to me what I did to you. Do not bite." He took me into his mouth again and lowered his hips so that his cock tapped against my lips. Uncertain, with only his direction to guide me, I lightly touched his cock with my tongue, feeling his hum of pleasure as a jolt through my own cock. Encouraged, I kept on, gently bathing him with my tongue until he groaned and shifted his lips lower, raising his head so that he could whisper, "Take me." Obediently, I opened my mouth wide, and he slid his cock between my lips, filling my mouth and cutting off my voice. His cock tasted of honey, salt, and something wonderful and exotic, and I eagerly swirled my tongue over the head, wanting more. The goblin moaned, increasing his own efforts until I was thrashing under him, moaning, sucking, licking, finally screaming as I spent. Laughing, he licked me clean and then trilled something. I felt the vines in my arms loosen and fall away. "Touch me," the goblin said, and I could not tell if he was commanding or begging. I slid my hands up the fur of his thighs, luxuriating in the softness, hearing the goblin moan and trill as he started to slowly pump in and out of my mouth. Inspired by what he had done to me, I wrapped my arms around his hips and slid one hand over his ass, running my fingers down his cleft, seeking the hidden entrance there. The goblin yowled like a cat in heat when my fingers found their target. He went rigid, and I felt his cock pulse, growing impossibly thicker. My mouth filled with warm liquid, thick, sweet salt, honey, and brandy. I swallowed, drinking deep, lost in pleasure. Then I lost myself in a soft, warm embrace as I fell asleep in the goblin's arms. I woke feeling soft fur under my cheek and long fingers in my hair. For a moment I was confused, and then everything came back to me, and I jumped up to see the goblin looking at me. "You are truly magnificent," he murmured. "There is something to you, something different. You are not like other mortals I have tasted. You are more like my own people." I couldn't speak. I stared at him for a moment, then turned away. I'd failed. Worst, I'd condemned myself to the same fate as Bess. A soft arm encircled my shoulders. "Whatever is wrong? Did I not please you?" His voice sounded truly concerned. I looked up into his golden eyes and decided to trust. "I came here because I needed to bring the goblin seed back to Bess, to save her life. I failed her." I didn't add that I'd condemned myself too. The goblin cocked his head to one side. "I don't understand. Your golden girl is ill?" I blinked. "You don't know? You don't know what happens when mortals come to the goblin market?" "No," the goblin answered. "Among my own people I am considered very young. I have had very few of your kind." I tried to gather my wits. "When a mortal comes to the goblin market, when we taste the goblin fruit, we pine for it, and we die in a matter of days. My mother, she thought that if we could get another taste, it would cure the need, but no one who's ever been here has ever been able to find you again." The goblin reared back, and I could see horror in his eyes. "Die? The golden girl will die because she lay with me?" He reached out and touched my arm. "You will die?" I nodded, surprised by the goblin's reaction, his obvious distress. He jerked to his feet, striding across the copse with none of his previous grace. Then he came back, throwing himself down onto his knees in front of me. "Mortal beloved, please believe me. I did not know." Stunned, I nodded again. I believe you." He curled himself into a small ball, his head resting on my knees. "We think of you as fruit to be plucked. I came with the others because I am old enough to mate now. I would have taken your essence, and I would have gone to the mating fields of my home. I would have shared what I had taken from you, and with the others, with the one that I desired, and if they found me worthy, they would have mated with me. No one told me that harvesting from you would mean your death." He raised his head, and I could see sorrow and regret. "I did not know it would hurt you. I did not know you were intelligent. I did not know that you knew love." He shook his head and stood, holding his hand out to me. "Come with me, mortal," he commanded. "Where?" "We will make the cure for your golden girl, and we will make a cure for you. Are you sure of this?" I shook my head. "No." He nodded. "Then we will try. And if it does not work, then we will find another way." I followed the goblin, my head spinning, trying to understand what he had told me. "But what about you?" "So long as I return to my home before dawn, I will be fine," he said. "Come and sit with me." He sat down with his back to a tree, and I knelt down next to him. He smiled at me and said sadly, "I wish you had not told me. I will not be able to bring myself to come again." "I'm sorry." It seemed like a silly thing to say, but I was sorry that I'd caused this compassionate creature pain. He reached out and patted my leg. "It is not your fault. Do you have something to carry the seed in?" I jumped up and ran back to my clothes, taking an empty bottle from my satchel and bringing it back. The goblin took it and set it aside, then looked at me and held out his arms. "Come and sit with me, mortal. Come, touch me, and help me to save your life." I moved into his embrace, resting my cheek against the soft fur of his chest. He guided me, telling where to touch him and how, until I knew what gave him pleasure and could do it without coaching. I coaxed him to fullness that way, and lay across him to lick his cock until he cried out and spilled his seed into his own hands. When he poured it into the bottle, the straw-colored liquid barely filled it to even a quarter. "Will it be enough?" he murmured. "For one, I think," I answered. "I'll bring it to Bess. Then you will come back. I will be ready for you when you return," the goblin said as he slid his arm around me. "I will not let you die. But you must be back here before the dawn. If I do not return home, the way between your world and mine will be sealed, and the goblin market will never again come to this place." Gently he pushed me away. "There is not much time." I scrambled into my clothes, taking the bottle in my hand and turning to leave the willows. I stopped, looking back to see the goblin looking at me. Quickly, I went over to him, leaned down and kissed him. "Thank you," I said quickly. Then I turned and ran. I ran all the way back to Grady's house, the precious bottle clutched in my fist, feeling the goblin's seed burning in my blood. I was gasping for breath as I reached the kitchen door, which opened immediately. Panting like a dog, I pushed past a shocked Moira and nearly collapsed onto the long table. She grabbed me and pushed me into a chair, then bustled away, returning with a cup that she shoved under my nose. "Drink it," she commanded. I nodded and tasted brandy. The taste reminded me of the goblin's kiss, and I pushed the glass away with shaking hands. "Moira, I have it," I said, holding up the bottle. She took it from me, looking at the liquid inside. "What is it?" she asked. It's the cure." I got to my feet, painfully aware of Moira's curious look, not wanting to tell her just what was in the bottle or how I had gotten it. I held my hand out and said, "There isn't much time." Moira nodded, handing the bottle back to me. I stood up and wove an unsteady path to the stairs and up to Bess's room. I let myself in and closed the door behind me, then turned to see Bess watching me, hunger plain on her face. "I brought it for you, Bess," I said, crossing to sit on the edge of the bed. I held the bottle to her lips and let her drink, fighting to keep my hands steady. She gulped the liquid greedily, draining the bottle and then licking her lips. She shivered violently, whimpered once, then wailed, her body going stiff and jerking hard against her bonds. I jumped back, dropping the bottle, and then grabbed at the ropes, fumbling with the knots until she was free. For a moment I was afraid that the goblin had tricked me, until Bess moaned softly and opened her eyes. She looked up at me and smiled. "God." Dizzy with relief, I pulled Bess into my arms, hugging her tightly, breathing in her scent. And it was her scent, my awareness of her as a woman, and my own growing need that pushed my restraint to the breaking point. I pushed her back down onto the bed, claiming her mouth in a possessive kiss and running my hands down her sides. She gasped in surprise, then giggled against my mouth and ran her hands up underneath my shirt. Behind us, the door crashed open. Someone grabbed me by the back of the neck and dragged me from the bed. I heard Bess scream, and then something came crashing down on the back of my head, and I knew nothing else. And we'll stop there. We'll get you the rest of this story in early January. If your desire for fantastic erotic audio isn't sated, you can get more every month over on the Patreon campaign at patreon.com/Nobilis. You can join our newest patron, Sean, in enjoying monthly bonus fiction, which currently is a transformation fetish serial called My Wild Card. Patrons are also granted access to the Discord server. Come join us and let us know what you think of this episode. And here is your reminder to pick up the second novel in my consentical science fiction series, Monster Whisperer Second Class, in your favorite ebook retailer or on the Riverdale Avenue Books website. You have been listening to the Nobilis Erotica podcast. Theme music is composed and performed by Mass Relay. This podcast is released under a Creative Commons Attribution Non-Commercial No Derivatives license. Until next time, listen hard.